Hi folks, it's Kirsten. I'm getting settled in here. I hope you're getting settled in. We'll start in about 5 minutes. I did pop up just a little poll. There's no right or wrong answers to it. I'm just curious. No one can see who answers what, so feel free if you'd like to think about what you do talk about when you're talking with folks and kind of spitball where it would fit entirely, mostly in balance on strengths or on the issues that they're facing. Oops, you know what? While I'm waiting, better get some water going. This webinar is based very much off of an article that I read that just kind of blew my mind. And so then I started searching and pulling stuff together that seemed to make sense as far as a good shift in lens. It's kind of interesting how when you change your perspective, how that changes how you think about things. So I'm looking forward to sharing what I've been thinking about lately. As always, this is being recorded. It's being recorded already. And we do put them on our ICADVA YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and you search for Iowa Coalition Against Domestic Violence, you'll find our channel. You won't find it just under our initials. But there you'll see most of our webinars. Once in a while something happens with the recording and we're not able to get it there, but most of our webinars are there. If you watch one of those and you're interested in handouts or resources that are referred to as part of it, just send us an email, and usually I can track down whatever was sent as part of that webinar and go ahead and send that along to you. So if you're interested in something, or you have folks that watch something and are, boy, I wish we had that worksheet that she talked about, I can usually dig it up and send it out. I'm kind of retentive about those things. A couple more minutes here. There were a lot of people registered for this, which means hopefully there's some curiosity. It's an interesting title to think, okay, what does healing-centered engagement mean, and is that what I'm doing, or can I shift to do more of that? I have a little poll. There's no right or wrong answers. It's just when you think about your conversations with the people you work with, what's the balance of those conversations? And so please feel free to go ahead and vote. I guess it's not a vote because there's no like no winning thing and there's no prize or nobody gets to be anything at the end of it. It's a poll, it's not a vote. So go ahead and pick your selection in the poll. No one can see who selects what. I'm just curious. I know it's been a little rainy on and off, but knock on wood, I don't want to jinx anything. We've had some nice weather the past couple of days, and at least for me, some nice weather coming up. By that I mean I kind of like it when it's still a little bit cooler. Once it gets up above 80, you can just forget it for me. So 60s and 70s, that's my speed. To be honest, 60s, 70s, and cloudy, that's my speed. I'm not much into the sunshine and the heat. People are continuing to trickle in. I have 12:01. So one more round of the spiel. You have a little symbol. It looks like a hand, sort of. It could be a hand. It could be a scared chicken. I'm not sure. But if you click on that, it will get my attention, hopefully. If you have a comment or a question, I'll also have plenty of time for comments and questions at the end. There's a little question mark as well that can get my attention. There's a chat box that you can chat to anybody in the group, or you can send it just to me if you have a comment or a question. If you would rather voice and say your comment or question rather than text it, I can unmute you particularly if you have a microphone or you're listening on your phone. And otherwise, everybody is on mute, so we get as clear an audio as possible. This is being recorded. And looks like the majority of you have gone ahead and voted, 86%. So we can use peer pressure against that last, 91%, against that last 9% who haven't entered their answer in that poll. 95%. Oh, 100%. Boom. Well, then we are ready to close. And take a look at it. So I have the majority, 82% say, you know, when I'm talking with folks I'm working with, it's pretty balanced. We do talk about both the issues that they're facing, their barriers, and also the strengths and things that are working well for them. And then I've got 18% saying, you know, we actually, most of it is focused on what those barriers are. No votes at all for focusing entirely on problems, focusing entirely on strengths, which I would expect, and nobody on focusing mostly on strengths. So just curious. So let's talk about this idea of healing-centered, there we go, healing-centered engagement. Every so often there's some new buzzword, some new flashy term that comes up.
Insanity runs in my family.
Sorry about that. Something that comes up that is like the new thing that you're supposed to do. And I wouldn't mind if this was the next thing. So when I think about healing-centered engagement, what I mean by that term, I'm starting to see it kind of on the edges of people's work with people, is that it is a form of helping that is explicitly political instead of clinical, that it is culturally and community grounded and looks at healing as being about restoring somebody's identity within their community. It is focused on strengths, on their assets, on the well-being that they want, rather than the symptoms that are causing them trouble or the issues that are presenting barriers. And it, of course, supports people with their own healing. In many ways, I think, as I go through and describe this, you'll go, well, yeah, we do this like that. That sounds like what we do. That sounds like what they do. And then there's parts of it's like, maybe we should do more of that. Okay, next. There we go. And as I said, while I was kind of blabbing to wait while people got a chance to sign on before we began, when you shift your lens just a little bit, it changes how you see an issue. So I loved this quote, just like the absence of disease doesn't constitute health, nor the absence of violence doesn't constitute peace, the reduction of pathology doesn't constitute well-being. Everyone wants to be happy, not just have less misery. And so healing-centered engagement is about enhancing the conditions that lead to well-being. So what are the strengths? What are the positives? What is working? And limiting treating the symptoms. And that's really it in a nutshell. Let me keep going. So I kind of see this progression where, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, the focus in lots of helping fields, and I'm not just talking about our kind of advocacy, but physical and mental health and substance abuse treatment, that often the focus has been, or even corrections, the focus has been what's wrong with you, right? What's up with you? What's wrong with you? You've got a problem. And then along with this push towards trauma-informed care, that question was changed, and the question became, what happened to you? Like, okay, who you are and what you're doing didn't suddenly appear in a vacuum. It is the result of a context. It's the result of experiences. So, what happened to you that got you to where you are today? And that can have both positives and negatives, right? Like, what happened that was good, what happened that allowed you to survive, and also what are the traumas that you experienced that have you talking with me today, right? You wouldn't be talking with me today if things were going great. So I think that trauma-informed care kind of moves us along this arrow, and then the healing-centered engagement is that box on the far right, which is what's right with you. So when you start, Lupe Serrano, who is she isn't currently, but she was the director of Casa de Esperanza, says when you start with problems, you get programs. And when you start with strengths, you get possibilities. And to me, that's what this is saying, that trauma-informed care moves us one step over from what's wrong with this person, and then the next step over is healing-centered engagement. What's right with you? What are your strengths? We know from our work with survivors that they do all kinds of things to increase their safety, to increase their well-being, and most of those things are through informal networks and resources. So they're already doing that work. How can we join them and connect with them in leveraging those things that they have found that are working great for them? And to me, that instantly connects with the idea that I've talked about in a lot of my trainings about working in areas where someone has power. This idea that on the kind of visually a model that there's this scale inside of us, and on one side is the traumas and all of those things that have happened to us and our barriers, and then on the other side is our self-capacity, our ability to maintain our identity, to maintain our self-esteem, to maintain our well-being, our resources, our ability to have and claim our own identity and our own action in the world. This is our self-capacity, and they have to be at least in balance. When somebody's trauma is greater than their self-capacity, you literally see people's self start to disintegrate. They get fragile, and they start doing things that they would never have done otherwise. They start doing things that are outside of their normal ethical matrix. They start engaging in all kinds of behaviors to try and get those things back in balance. And so we're really limited in working on people's trauma. For survivors of domestic abuse, they can't stop the person doing harm from doing harm, right? So they're limited. Law enforcement is limited. We're limited. We can't change that person's behaviors. And if you're talking about trauma that happened in the past, if you're talking about the assaults that happened last week, or the sexual abuse that happened when they were 10, the past doesn't get any better. So there isn't a lot of power to work on the trauma side of this particular equation. So our power has always been to work with the self-capacity side, and the power for that survivor has always been to increase their self-capacity. So even if the circumstances and the trauma can become worse, so long as their self-capacity still outweighs their trauma, that is essential to their well-being. They can survive so long as the balance is that their self-capacity is greater. And to me, one of the things I like about this, for one, the survivor is working where they have control. We're helping them where they have control. But it also means that we can work with somebody without the full story, if you will, without them having to remember, without them having to tell. You can work in different areas when one path is blocked. And self-capacity is, even though I say self, it's also about resources. It's not just about me, but who I am in relation to my family and who I am in relation to my community. So it kind of extends outward from the self to talk about family and community capacity to outweigh whatever trauma and violence are happening. Again, we know that the majority of survivors do not seek or even want our services, and when they are asked about that, their answers are pretty consistent. They don't see our services as relevant, they don't see our services as culturally appropriate, or they see our services as stigmatizing and presenting a barrier in and of themselves. If we work on the self-capacity side, so rather than saying, in order to serve you, in order for me to serve you, you have to identify yourself as a survivor of domestic violence. If I can just serve somebody without them having to take that label on, I can do all kinds of things on that self-capacity side without us having a deep conversation about what domestic violence is and isn't, without them having to assume a label that they are not comfortable with, or that they don't see as even being their greatest concern. Like they have 20 different things going on in their life, and domestic violence is really only number 12, right? So all of this to me fits with this idea of healing-centered engagement. Now, again, I have used this for training about safety planning before, so some of you may have seen it. Excuse me, small slurp there. And so this is my idea of, okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to do safety planning with somebody. And we're going to talk about two situations. What's going to happen? They're living with their batterer, with the person doing harm, or they're not living with. And so we need to look at what are the risks that person in particular generates. What are the ways that they are abusing? What's the different power and control tactics that they're using for both of those situations? And also, what are the risks that they face generally in their life? Health conditions, racism, their immigration status, socioeconomic issues, all kinds of things, mental health issues, addiction. can fit under the life-generated risks. And then, is there a strategy we can use that would reduce the trauma? And as I said, unfortunately, that's a place where there's often not a whole lot that can be done. So what could we do to increase self-capacity for each one of those risks within those two situations? So when I think of safety planning, this is how it has worked in my head. And that gives me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If I can come up with 8 different strategies, one of those will enhance that person's well-being, right? At least one of those should be able to work. At least one of those we can do something with. But we're probably going to need resources for any of those 8. Now, great. However, now I'm going to flip over to that healing-centered engagement lens. And let's just say, I wrote this little safety planning matrix. I really like it. I am fond of it. And now I'm looking at it with new eyes, okay? And when I look at it with new eyes, what I see is that this not living with or living with this person doing harm is me defining the situation. Number one. Okay, we got 2 situations to deal with, and these are what they are. That to me is problematic. Again, many survivors, they live at this intersection of poverty and multiple forms of violence. They live at the intersection of poverty and illness and violence and all of those things that I talked about as life risks. So to start off with myself defining the situation as, okay, let's talk about living with or not living with this person, it's kind of presumptuous at the very least. So when I put a new lens on it and I take out, and I think, what about strengths and advantages instead of barriers? If I'm just going to talk about what are the strengths and advantages of living with the person causing harm, of not living with that person, what are the strategies that could grow or strengthen those strengths and advantages? And then I can go one step further. And I can say, maybe for that particular person that I'm working with, their situation is actually divided up as myself, my family, and my community. So if I was really focusing on their strengths, what strengths do they have within themselves and advantages within themselves? How could that be grown? And what resources would help with that? What are the strengths and advantages within their family? So I actually have 3 categories across this middle instead of just the 2 boxes under each of these. How could they grow or strengthen those things with the family and then within their community? So for example, I might be talking to someone who says, well, some of my strengths, let's see, I have close ties to my siblings and I am deeply rooted in my community. My family's lived here for a long time, and so I kind of know what my resources are. I've got lots of knowledge of welfare systems and how they work and how you can get your needs met through them. Let's see, I'm really good at reupholstering furniture. Yeah, I'm great at that. I can pick up curbside couches and I can turn them into works of art and things that you would be happy to have in your home. And let's see, and I love to read. So we can say, okay, that sounds like a lot of strengths and advantages. So how could we strengthen them? Well, let's see, with siblings, we could talk about, it would be great if just once a month I could have time to connect with my siblings outside of calling because there's a problem or calling because there's somebody's birthday, just to sit down and relax and chat and share with each other. So you know what? I think I'm going to have like coffee dates with my siblings, one at a time or all together if we can. Let's see, I have deep roots in my community. What if I started paying attention to city council meetings and going to that, especially around housing issues? Because, again, I have a lot of knowledge of what's going on for people who are on the downside of the economy in my local town, in my county. So I could start paying attention to that, and I could even maybe address them when they were talking about rezoning or, whatever community planning around housing, and that might make me feel powerful and like I have a voice. You know what? That sounds kind of scary and risky, so maybe I could start talking with other people about affordable housing, and maybe there's this small group that's starting to going in the town to push for more affordable housing, and maybe I could join in with them. And you know what? I am really good at that upholstering, so is it possible that I could turn that into some kind of a small business? Is it possible I could get even a small business loan and do that? Let's see, I said I love reading. Could I start a book club or be part of a book club or volunteer to be a reading partner for kids that are learning to read at my school? Could I maybe trade tutoring on reading with some of the people I know for some things that I need, like childcare? Like, I will tutor your kid on reading if you will watch my kid after school on Tuesdays, or maybe I could trade upholstering for childcare. So those are the kinds. That's an entirely different way of looking at this matrix and thinking about safety planning. It's almost like creating a toolkit, if you will, of possibilities for that person or with that person. One of the things that I remembered when I started pulling this together and thinking about is this lovely flower of human needs that instead of Maslow's hierarchy, I don't know what else to call it, but a flower that that I ran across last year. Annie, who came and did some circle training for the coalition, she brought it to one of those trainings. And what I like about it, again, how we all feel about hierarchies as opposed to circles. We're all about the circles. What I like about this is if it's not hierarchical, it says, you know what, we need all of these things to be at our best, to have well-being. And what's interesting is how they are often things that are in tension, like we need both challenge and safety. And those are opposite petals. So we need to be able to play, we need to take risks, but we also need the safety. We need security and justice and familiarity. We need both work so that we feel productive and we feel like we have competence and we're contributing, but we also need rest, and we need to have humor, and we need to be able to celebrate and to mourn. We need to have autonomy and be able to make our own choices, but we also need community. We need to feel like we are part of something, and of course we are interdependent. And so I loved how, rather than a hierarchy, it's looking at these human needs and how they exist in balance or in tension with each other, and how there's a lot of petals on this, where if somebody was like, you know what, I feel like my life is out of control because I'm spending so much time taking care of other people and giving to them and listening to them, and I'm the person they always come to and talk to, and I'm so tired of doing the emotional work for everybody, then you can look at that and go, so I see a lot of empathy there as a strength. But on the other side of that, the balance to that is honesty, and part of that is integrity, openness, clarity, and I would also say probably some boundaries. Like, I need to have an honest conversation with you about what I can and can't do. And honesty and empathy, they go hand in hand. You have to have both. So I think it offers a new way to think about people's strengths and a new way to think about where their well-being, and I say them, and I also mean for myself, where their well-being might be out of balance. And so what's the opposite of that I might need a little bit more of to work on? So interesting. I loved it. And again, it talks about existing on both the personal, the family, and the community level, right? I think it's also important when we're thinking about healing-centered engagement, to be mindful of power and to pay attention to power dynamics. I think that a lot of times in our work, we focus on power over issues for our clients. So we spend so much time focusing on the ways that they are subjected to power over. What happens if we take a different lens and we look at other kinds of power that they are experiencing, like power, their own power within, their power to, their power with, and just as a little example, PowerCube.net has, I pulled their explanation cartoons about different kinds of power. So power over being a kind of win-lose relationship, and having power involves taking power from somebody else and using it to dominate and prevent others from getting access to that power. So you have these two folks sitting here, and the person who is the funder saying, well, we're most happy to fund your HIV programs as long as they don't promote condom use. So they have power over because of the money. Then we have power within as that person's sense of self-worth and self-knowledge, their ability to recognize individual differences and respect others. So power within is that capacity to have hope and to imagine and to affirm your own dignity, right? So here's somebody who is a political prisoner and they are in jail. They should be like having the worst day of their life, and they're saying, you know what, a new day, I must check my to-do list. So there's still the sense of, I have power within. Power to is that unique potential for every person to shape their life and their world. And so here you have the person saying, they said my farming days were over when I lost my legs, but because of their own ingenuity, they're able to accommodate that and say, but they were wrong. And of course, I was going to say cow, but that's not a cow pulling it. What is it? It's a bovine of some kind pulling it, pulling the plow. Not so happy about it. And then we have power with, and of course, power with is the locust saying, oh well, we're just little locusts, we can't do anything. But when they get together, they can do a whole lot, right? They have a huge impact. So power with is finding that common ground amongst different interests and building collective strength. So it's mutual support, solidarity, collaboration, multiplying the individual talents that people bring. So a healing-centered approach is holistic. It involves culture, spirituality, civic action, collective healing. So it's not just about one person who's having a hard time in their personal, intimate relationship, in their family. It is about how are we as a community, how are our families, not only the person I'm serving, but my own, affected by intimate partner violence? How are the children in the schools that go to the school in my neighborhood affected? It is looking at the whole of us. Trauma, if one person is hurting, then all of us are hurting. So when you shift the lens away from a personal experience, personal failure, and I found this when I've done like support groups, or when I used to do the Batter Intervention Program classes for women who had been convicted of domestic abuse. And there, particularly because I did it from the approach that they were self-defending survivors. And I had usually had the opportunity to screen out folks who were not in that category. And of course, that meant that 90% of the people coming to me were in fact self-defending survivors. And they would come to that group and they would be like, I'm clearly part of the problem. I did use violence against my partner. I pushed them, or I threw something at them, or whatever else. Very self-blaming and feeling like they had failed. And when we talked about their experience within a larger system of patriarchy within a larger system involving all kinds of intersecting identities and oppression, they would sometimes have this aha moment where you could see realizing that the system was rigged. It wasn't their own failure. And that seeing that other people were facing that same experience, they felt like they were validated and they weren't alone. And they were energized by that change in understanding of what was going on. It wasn't about them. Their trauma was not a fault. It was actually an inherent part of the system. What do they call it? Not a bug, but a feature. It was a feature. So if connectedness is the key, then we need to take a look at what it would mean to restore communities and not just individuals. It requires us to focus on social justice and not just helping people to survive systems. It makes me think about things like volunteerism as healing, social activism as healing, that well-being often comes from participating in transforming the root causes of harm. I know that our funders, DHS and, housing authorities and mental health providers, you name it, everybody has a different idea, a different measure of what success is for the folks that we work with. And we shape our programs to conform with that level of, with that measure of success, particularly for our funders, because they're the ones that are telling us what it should look like. But what that means is that the survivor is often left out of defining what success looks like. There was just 2 years ago, the Full Frame Initiative in California was research done just specifically on this question of asking survivors, what is success? Sitting down and doing interviews, what is success? And for the vast majority of them, for 93% of them, when they talked about what success was for them, it was about connections with others. It was about their accomplishments that were outside of the abusive relationship. It was about the normalcy of everyday life carrying them. And only 7% talked about leaving or somehow altering their relationship with their partner as being part of what success was. So, as I said, I think survivors are often far ahead of us in looking at working on the part of the balance where they have the ability to create change, where they have power to act. They did not talk about support groups. Success was not about connecting with other survivors as like, I'm going to come to this group and we're going to talk about how we all have the same barriers and problems. It was about being connected and belonging to something bigger than themselves. That's what made them feel like they had success. So when I think about what that would look like for support groups, maybe it's so hard to keep going to one because people get tired of talking about what's bad. They want to feel empowered by being empowered. So instead of success in a support group, it's success as part of a housing action committee. We want more affordable housing in our community, and together we got the city council to do XYZ. Or Moms Demand Action is a gun control progressive national movement. So maybe it's starting or being part of something around a particular issue. Maybe it's being part of a parent-partner mentoring. That's a specific thing through DHS, parent partners, but it could also be an informal thing that does that kind of work that's through your agency, or your agency collaborates with parent partners and brings people in as mentors. School prevention campaigns. I've had this experience, and I'm going to change the world for my sons and my daughters, and together we are acting. That might be a different idea around what does support group really do and how does it function. We know that the person doing harm plays lots of roles in people's lives. They do cause harm, but they also often provide safety in terms of other needs like housing or childcare or transportation, and even emotional support, right? That person who says, this was the worst relationship in my life and also the best relationship in my life. This is the person I've had my peak moments with. This is the person that I have shared the most with, that I have been the most intimate with emotionally, and also they're the person causing harm. So when I think of safety planning, is safety planning about, again, an individual plan with that person, or do we shift that lens? Can we talk about safer communities? I've seen different campaigns around stuff in bathrooms about what's a healthy relationship and where resources are. You may have seen little libraries around your neighborhood. That's something that's just gone crazy in Ames, where I live lately. There's lots of little libraries where people just put up a small waterproof box, if you will, on a stand, and people can come and take what they need from of those books. They can leave books. There's also a movement just similar to that of little pantries. So you might find canned goods in there, or boxes of mac and cheese, something that is good. Again, it has to be a weatherproof box, and it's food that's going to survive outside, right? So that people can just come by. They don't have to fill out any forms. They don't have to show that they need help. They can come by and they can pick up something for their kids to eat that night, right? Community gardens, helping with wellness clinics, sponsoring wellness clinics. All of those might be part of safety planning if we are focusing on healing-centered engagement. Where are the strengths, and where can we build on the wellness that is in our communities? And then I tried to think about system advocacy. And again, this is me brainstorming and visioning and imagining on all of these. What happens when I look with a different lens? And when I think of system advocacy, sometimes it is helping one person navigate a system, helping one person to survive within a system, and other times it's about changing systems. And I would like to think more along the lines of changing systems so they aren't harmful. And so what if survivors were engaged themselves in system advocacy? What if survivors were doing court watch, where you go and you sit in court and you learn about how the process works by watching it, and you're also holding judges accountable, prosecutors accountable, tenant associations holding a particular landlord accountable because all of those buildings are experiencing the same problems, public demonstrations and actions. We are hopefully somewhat familiar with that one. And changing our movement narratives. Even in the language that I'm using, I am putting a line between ourselves and the people that we serve. And there's an ethical dilemma there, I think, that we have often struggled with and gone one way or the other, more or less, throughout the lifespan of this movement. And that is valuing, needing to center, wanting to honor the voices of survivors, like they should be the leadership, and also not wanting to cause harm. And so, and not wanting to wear people out, not wanting to re-traumatize. And those two goods are often in conflict, because I think both of those are valid concerns. But sometimes, as I said, we've gone too far towards using people up, and then gone too far towards setting strong barriers and saying, no, we'll say when you're allowed to be part of this movement. We will say when you are healed enough, when you are safe enough, as though somehow we ourselves are healed and safe, and that's just false, right? That's a false dichotomy. We are not ourselves, the people who are already on the inside of the movement, safe or safer in any means than anybody that is set on the outside and said, well, you're not ready yet. And when I think about that, and I think about if we considered ourselves to be a collective movement where it wasn't us serving survivors, but it was survivors who are us and we are survivors, that it is all of us working together. We don't want to, we're going to determine who's part of this movement and who's not. Also means that we sometimes drain our own batteries to empower our clients. And I think by shifting and thinking, wait a minute, it's not just us over here, providing services, but it's all of us together working towards this, that allows some of that burden to be shared, both the empowerment, like survivors empower us, and also some of the pain to be shared both ways. Because again, when I say us versus survivors, that's just not true. We are survivors ourselves. Many of us are survivors inside the work, and many of us are survivors like have experienced violence. Many of us are secondary PTSD survivors. Many of our families are impacted by the work and have their lives changed. So if we think about, okay, that's the downside, what is the positive? What is our healing-centered engagement? Maybe focusing this lens in a different way is actually healing for us as service providers as well. And that does mean, and this is one of the things that I've been thinking about and struggling with, and I have no answers, that does mean taking a look at the boundaries that we have set up and the language that we have set up. Where the beliefs of our movement is intimate partner violence, that is the root of this person's problem. And if we address that, it shifts their life to the better. And positive opportunities are really only possible after those shifts have happened and they're safe. And what survivors are saying is, no, there's lots of positive opportunities when I am just as unsafe as I was yesterday. And addressing the intimate partner violence doesn't actually necessarily make my life and my well-being any better. And particularly when you think of that, there really is not a wall or a boundary between those of us who have this as our job description and those of us who are in our computer systems as receiving the services. I think that increasing our own vulnerability and engaging with people in a different way, as much more peer-to-peer, empowers us. It does make us more vulnerable. What are those boundaries? Oh, well, I would never do X, Y, and Z with a client because that would be violating a boundary. I am starting to wonder about those things. What does it mean to actually form mutual, supportive, healing relationships with clients? And as I said, I don't have answers. But I have lots of questions, and I think they're questions that we need to start exploring. I think healing-centered engagement is as much about us as it is about the folks that we hopefully are doing the work for and helping. So it is building empathy. It encourages visioning. What what does success look like for that person? And if they mention nothing about domestic violence, nothing about safety, that is okay. Nurturing that kind of power analysis, that kind of larger view of what's going on with somebody's life, and absolutely taking political action, absolutely working in communities, doing anti-oppression work. That's what healing-centered engagement is, doing it alongside of and not on behalf of. Because the on behalf of is really on behalf of ourselves as well. And we need to kind of be honest about that. I'm actually working for this for me and for my safety and my well-being and my health. The last thing I have to throw out there is this quote: "I am more than what happened to me. I'm not just my trauma." And I think that sums up everything I have just said for the last 46 minutes. So, yeah, that's all I have to say. I haven't seen the hand go up or the question mark go up. So I guess this is your philosophical for lunch. Time to think about what I'm doing and what we're doing in our programming, and I always feel like the more I know, the more questions I have, and that's a good thing. So I have one more poll for you. And that is, I want to ask about this boundary issue. When you think about removing whatever boundaries, and sometimes they're even in personnel policies or training handbooks, when you think about removing boundaries between yourselves and those you serve, again, how do you, just a gut reaction. I don't, again, no one's seeing who's doing what, who answers what, but I'm just curious. And my answer would probably change on which day you ask me. It might depend on who I had just talked to on the phone. I remember one time I was sitting waiting to do expert witness testimony, and the particular person, I was with her attorney and her outside the courtroom, and it was, the small talk. I'd never met the person before. It was just kind of the chatty, and I said something to her about, she was very nervous, she was very scared, of course, and I said something about how I appreciated the fact that she, and I don't remember if it was for Memorial Day, some parade thing that they often had in town, would go past one of the houses that she had lived at, and that I remembered that, I figured that out, and that I had appreciated the fact she always had like Kool-Aid out there for the kids. And that was just a very nice thing. And I was trying to come up with small talk just to be personable. And she really latched onto that. And she was, oh, so did I live in Ames too? And if my kids did we, we must have lived in the same neighborhood, and all of these things. It was getting very personal suddenly about where I lived and where she lived, and I suddenly felt very uncomfortable, like I had shared too much. And I know that my next response, the next couple times I was in that situation, was to barely even look at that person, much less try and say anything that was just friendly. And I think so I wonder about that. My first instinct was to just be one person to another person saying, hey, you used to do something for our community that was nice, and you have had this strength, and it was a great thing, and thank you. And how I suddenly felt terrible about that. So I'm wondering about situations like that myself right now. So what I see for most people having voted, let me close this out and send it all to you. Share. Lots of people cautious and unsure. Yep. Some people hopeful and curious. Some folks are like, nope, I'm right there. There isn't a line between us. And other folks going, no, that really does. It makes my tummy kind of collywobble. Yes, worried. So now your curiosity has been satisfied too, at least for all of us who are asking these questions. And now I hope you're asking these questions more. This is what I have to say about healing-centered engagement. I'm turning that phrase over and over in my head and asking myself in any situation, so if I was taking that lens, healing-centered engagement, and I was political, and I was about community, and I was about it being all of us, what would that look like? And now I'm passing that lens on to you. And I thank you very much for hearing it and for spending your lunchtime or your post-lunchtime or your pre-lunchtime, because I assume that everybody has lunch, except for those of you who are fasting for Ramadan. Thank you also for joining for your non-lunch time. And happy Ramadan. And everybody have a good rest of the week. And I will be posting some more upcoming webinars, maybe by the end of the day or by tomorrow, and some more training opportunities very soon.